Let me meet you on the mountain, Lord, just once. You wouldn't have to burn a whole bush, just a few smoking branches, and I would surely be your Moses. Let me meet you on the water, Lord, just once. Wouldn't have to be on Kirby Lake, just on a puddle after the annual West Texas rain, and I would surely be your Peter. Let me meet you on the road, Lord, just once. You wouldn't have to blind me on the winter's freeway, just a few bright lights on the way to church, and I would surely be your Paul. Let me meet you, Lord, just once. Anywhere, anytime, just meeting you in the Word is so hard sometimes. Must I always be your Thomas? How many of us have dealt with doubt? How many of us have ever struggled with the baggage of doubt? Some of you may be struggling with it right now. I want to encourage you by saying that doubt typically falls into one of two categories: reasonable and unreasonable. Obviously, it's the unreasonable that we want to stay away from, because when unreasonable doubt infiltrates your heart, it can overrule your faith and therefore draw you away from God and keep you from being everything that you need to be in a relationship with God as a child of God. But there is a bit of doubt that can be constructive, that can be helpful, that is not destructive. I think all of us, in our most honest and sincere moments, could recite the words of the Father in Mark chapter 9 when He brings His demon-possessed son to Jesus for healing. And He says, "Lord, I believe. Help my unbelief." Many of us have gaps in our faith that we need filled. Maybe there are questions, maybe there are times when we need reassurance. And certainly, we can see how that can help us in our faith as well. But if we had knowledge, we don't need faith. Like the little poem I read to you, and obviously I put a bit of a touch on it to match us here at Oldham Lane in Abilene, but I think sometimes when we expect to have every answer laid out for us, or when we expect the signs to be ever present in front of us, that gets into the area of knowledge. And if you have knowledge, you don't need faith necessarily, right? And so we have to be careful. All of us, I think, have at one time or another walked that fine line or straddled that fence of faith and maybe having some questions. Doubt can be a very effective tool for Satan, a tool that he has at his disposal. The fictional story is told that Satan was selling off his tools of deception and the things that he used to draw people over to him. And somebody asked him, how much are you asking for that wedge of doubt there? And he said, "Oh, that's not for sale. Because with doubt, I can always get back into business anytime I want." And certainly that is true. Doubt can be very destructive to our faith. However, there is such a thing as beneficial doubt. A dose of doubt, if handled properly, can be very effective in helping our faith to grow. As I said, doubt can really be separated into one of two categories: reasonable or unreasonable. And I think one major misconception we have about doubt is the myth that doubt is the opposite of faith. And that's not true. Unbelief is the opposite of faith, not doubt. You know, there is this belief that everyone goes through a few stages before they reach an owned faith. And an owned faith meaning that it's your faith. It belongs to you. First is observed faith. You look at the people around you and you say, "Yeah, I believe what they believe," because that's what they believe. You observe it and therefore you take it in and you associate with it. Second is affiliated faith. Affiliated faith is where you really have the faith of your parents. It's the way they brought you up. That's what they've told you that they believe, and therefore you believe it too. Or maybe it's the affiliation you have with your congregation. The third stage is struggling faith or doubt. And then, of course, is owned faith. And I want to tell you that I've known of many people, myself included, that never would have reached owned faith if they hadn't gone through that struggling part. Asking questions. I am here today because I asked questions, because I questioned my faith. So questioning, struggling at times can be very beneficial in helping us to reach a mature faith. We see this in everyday life, in the physical world around us. It would have been beneficial if those adherents or followers of David Koresh would have questioned him. It would have been very beneficial to them if they would have questioned their leader. Those people who committed suicide by drinking that Kool-Aid because they thought they would ride on the tail of Halley's Comet or whatever it was. Remember that story many years ago? Those followers would have benefited greatly by asking some questions, by doubting their leader. Those who bought into Adolf Hitler and what he was teaching would have been doing themselves a lot of good by questioning what he was teaching, examining it. A mature faith is one that has gone through some struggles, that has dealt with adversity, that has asked some questions. A mature faith is one that has been through the fires of tribulation. Many times a mature faith is one that has been subjected to contemplative questioning. It's been said that one cannot really reach a strong faith and own faith unless they subject it to a close examination. Paul said this in 1 Thessalonians 5:21 and 22. But examine everything carefully. Hold fast to that which is good. Abstain from every form of evil. Examine everything carefully. You've heard me say this before and use it as an example many times, but it speaks volumes to this. The noble-minded Bereans in Acts chapter 17. They examined very carefully everything that was being taught to them. They went to the Scriptures to see if these things were so. And who was teaching them? Holy Spirit-inspired men, right? And yet they still examined it. We need to be willing to examine. In the 3rd and 4th chapters of the book of Exodus, Moses is commissioned by God to be his spokesperson, to be his mouthpiece, and to be his ambassador, to be the leader of his people, to lead them out of slavery. And you'll remember that Moses wasn't very keen on this idea. But anytime that God sent a new word, he sent signs to accompany it. He did that when he sent Jesus. He did that when he sent Moses. And you remember that Moses had that staff, and God tells him to throw it on the ground, and it becomes a serpent. And he tells him to pick it up again by the tail, and it becomes a staff. He tells him to put his hand in his cloak. He pulls it out, it's leprous. He tells him to put it back in, pulls it out, and it's healed. You know, God is telling Moses, you want to trust me? Then consider what I'm going to do. Consider the evidence. In the 3rd chapter of the book of John, we learn of a Pharisee by the name of Nicodemus. Nicodemus makes a profound statement in verse 2 when he comes to Jesus and says, Rabbi, we know that you have come from God as a teacher, for no one can do these signs that you do unless God is with him. My point is, both Moses and Nicodemus considered the evidence. The evidence was laid before them. Consider it. Consider who I am based on the evidence. And of course, the evidence pointed directly to someone they could put their full faith and trust in. The book of John chapter 9, we see a man who was healed of his blindness. Remember that story that Jesus made clay with saliva and anointed the eyes of this blind man with that clay. And the man begins to be questioned about his healing. The Pharisees were not happy because Jesus was doing this on the Sabbath, and therefore he was a sinner, and they wanted to discredit him. And so they began questioning him. Give God the glory. We know that Jesus is a sinner. And this man responded by saying, whether he is a sinner or not, I do not know. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see. In essence, this man is saying, you can say whatever you want about this man Jesus. All I can tell you is what happened to me. I considered the evidence, and the evidence points directly at Jesus, someone who healed me of my blindness. Consider the evidence. Consider John the Baptizer, sitting, waiting to be executed, to be beheaded. You would think if anyone would have been immune to the doubt virus, it would have been this man. He had given his entire life to paving the way for Jesus. He personally baptized Jesus, witnessed the heavens opening up and God proclaiming, this is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased. John even said himself, I myself have seen and have testified that this is the Son of God. Yet, while he was awaiting execution, it seems that a bit of doubt creeped in, didn't it? And he sent some friends to question Jesus one last time. Luke chapter 7, it tells us that John sent 2 of his disciples to track down Jesus and to ask him point blank, are you the expected one, Or do we look for someone else? Notice again that question. Are you the expected one? The Greek for expected one there is the word erchomai, and it literally means coming one. John had used this same word in Matthew chapter 3 and verse 11 when he spoke of the one who was coming after me. John hadn't hesitated to declare that Jesus was the Messiah earlier in his ministry, but now, sitting on the brink of execution, he seems to have some doubts, or at least wants some confirmation, right? And Jesus, as these two men come to him asking for confirmation for their friend John, notice that Jesus doesn't condemn them. He doesn't say, well, that John should know better by now. Who does he think he is, questioning my integrity and my deity? No, in fact, Jesus praises John. We read later on in verse 28 of Luke 7, I say to you, among those born of women, there is no one greater than John. You know, we kind of have this idea that God's going to condemn any kind of doubt or question that I have. Not necessarily true. Jesus doesn't condemn John. He tells John's disciples, go and report to John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised up, the poor have the gospel preached to them. In other words, consider the evidence. Jesus didn't point blank tell him, yes, go and tell John it's okay. I am who he thinks I am. He has no reason to worry. No, he says, tell him to consider the evidence. Tell him to reflect back on all that he has seen and all that he knows about my awesome power, about my deity, about who I am. If John couldn't put his faith in Jesus after all that Jesus had done, then just telling him probably wouldn't have worked either. You know, it's been my experience that when you scratch below the surface, there is either a will to believe or not to believe. I have found, I'm sure you've come in contact with people that want to question just to be questioning. They never want to land anywhere. They just want to perpetually ask questions and never fall in one category. And then there are those folks who reject or ignore the evidence and walk away. And of course, there are those who have considered the evidence and accepted it and have walked in faith. Obviously, we want to be the latter. There are many definitions or catchy little phrases associated with faith and what it means to trust and rely on God, even though we don't have all of those questions answered for us. The one I like the best is that faith is the decision to follow the best light you have about God and not quit. When does doubt lead to unbelief? When you let it. So don't let it. Don't allow doubt to lead you down a path of unbelief. Faith at its taproot is a decision of the will. We all have a choice whether to follow God or not. We choose faith, and I believe we continue to choose faith daily. In our daily walk with God, we continually choose faith. Faith is a verb. It's something that you do. It's not an emotional high or some mental assent. It's an action. And it's something that we do constantly. Faith moves. It does something, as we've talked about. It's never just some sort of mental assent. It's an experience. As Psalm 34:8 reads, "Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. Taste and see for yourself. Experience God through faith, and you will find that He is good." And many of us have done that. Many of us have tasted and seen that the Lord is good. We have seen what He has done in our daily lives. We have seen how He has brought us from the depths of despair to being able to overcome those things, those trials, those tribulations. We've been tested by the fires, and we've come out refined on the other side. We have seen God take care of us over and over again. We have seen Him bless us in so many ways. We have tasted and seen that the Lord is good. Did we have the benefit of witnessing those miracles firsthand that Jesus did? No. We can read about them. We consider the evidence. And we believe in our heart that the evidence points directly to a resurrected Messiah. And so we buy in. We invest everything. I think Christ speaks to all of us when He tells Thomas, "Because you have seen me, have you believed? Blessed are they who did not see and yet believed." Wouldn't it be bad to be known for only one moment in your life? Can you imagine that? Can you imagine just for being known for one bad moment in your life, or maybe one moment that you'd rather forget? You know, we see that in the world around us. We see many celebrities or people who became infamous for just one moment. You know, I think of Bill Buckner for the Boston Red Sox. You know, he let that ground ball go through his legs at first base and probably would have sealed the deal for the Boston Red Sox and winning the World Series over the New York Mets. Yeah, Rob Fortner shaking his head. That's a sore spot with him. Bill Buckner is known for that one moment, and yet he was a great baseball player. All that gets overshadowed by that one moment. You know, we often talk about and have a debate of whether Tony Romo is the right quarterback for the Dallas Cowboys, and you look at it statistically, he's as good as anybody. He just seems to make mistakes when it counts, right? People get defined by things that they'd rather not be defined by. And I think that's the case with Thomas. I feel bad for Thomas. I think he gets a bad rap. I want to be an apologist just for a few minutes for Thomas, because I think he is someone who gets known for only one moment in his life, when in fact there were some other things that Thomas did that were very good. Thomas is often associated with doubt. In fact, through the years, he has gained what moniker? Doubting Thomas, right? And if you look up the phrase Doubting Thomas in the dictionary, you will find a definition that states something along the lines of this: a person who refuses to believe without proof, a skeptic, a person who insists on proof before he will believe anything. A doubting Thomas is someone who always lags behind in matters of faith, always needs more proof and more time. Thomas has become synonymous with doubt. But is the nickname Doubting Thomas deserved? For starters, he was one of the 12, which means he invested in following Jesus. There is no question that Thomas was loyal and committed. In John chapter 11, we see Jesus facing increasing hostility from the religious leadership. And as he was on his way to raise Lazarus from the dead, there was great concern that there might be an attempt to kill him. And Jesus decides to go anyway. And at that point, Thomas boldly speaks up and says, "Let us also go so that we may die with him." Thomas was willing to die for the one that he was following. Add to all of this the fact that Thomas wasn't the only one who didn't believe. He gets singled out, but he wasn't the only one that had questionable behavior at this time, right? And though he chose not to believe until he could look upon Jesus with his own eye, Thomas's response upon seeing the risen Christ was immediate and truly magnificent. He simply stated, "My Lord and my God." Thomas was the first to confess Christ in utterly unambiguous terms. But all that gets overlooked, doesn't it? All of that gets overshadowed. J.W. McGarvey wrote, "It should be said in Thomas's favor that if his doubts were heaviest, his confession of faith was fullest. He had more doubts as to the resurrection because it meant more to him. It meant that Jesus was none other than God himself." And I don't know how many of us wouldn't have been the same way had we had been in his sandals. I'm not sure many of us wouldn't have done the same thing. He gets a bad rap. I'm not sure that he deserves that. He's remembered for one moment in time, not the time when he boldly and courageously said, "Let us go and die with Christ." Not for that moment where he said, "My Lord and my God." No, he's rather known for the moment when he says, "Unless I see it myself, I don't believe." Now, we don't know if he actually put his hands into the holes. We don't know if he actually took Jesus up on his offer, but when he saw Jesus, he considered the evidence, and it was compelling, wasn't it? It was overpowering. Blessed are those of us who haven't seen that firsthand, but can read about it and consider the evidence in God's written word and believe. The ball's in our court. We can choose to believe or not to believe. We've been given that free will. But once you consider the evidence, I think you'll find that it's very compelling. Kind of like the story, and I may have shared this with you before. If so, just humor me. But there was a defendant who was on trial for murder. And his lawyer knew that he was probably going to be convicted, but there was one caveat, and that is there was no corpse. He was on trial for murder, but no one had ever produced a dead body. And so the lawyer for this defendant tried to use that to his advantage. He tried some trickery. He got before the jury and he said, within the next minute, the deceased is going to walk through the doors of this courtroom. So the jury looked to those doors. They waited. A minute passed, and nothing happened. And the lawyer said, I was actually just teasing you. I made that up. But the fact that y'all all looked and waited shows that there's reasonable doubt in this case. And so I'm going to plead with you to return a verdict of not guilty. And so the jury, somewhat confused, retires to their chambers. They discuss it, and within a few minutes they come back and they return a verdict of guilty. And the lawyer for the defendant says, wait a minute, how could you convict? I said there was reasonable doubt because you all looked at the courtroom doors expecting him to walk in. He said, the jury foreman said, yeah, we all looked, but your client didn't. The issue is whether to believe or not. That is in your hands. The evidence is there. Consider it and make the best decision possible. And I think you'll find that the best decision, and really the only decision, is to step out in faith. Will there be some questions at times? Will there be some struggles? Sure. Faith is going to come with some hardships in those areas. There will be times when we want to know why. There may be times when our faith falters to some degree. But the only option, the best option, is investing completely, buying in totally, and stepping out and walking in faith. And if you're not doing that tonight, then let us help you. Maybe you're not a child of God and you're ready to put on Christ in baptism. We want to do that. We want to take care of that tonight as well. Maybe I should come forward because of that bad joke, right? You didn't respond to that like I thought you would. Maybe you need the prayers and support of this church family. We want to help you with that. It's been a great day. It always is when we have a chance to come together as a church family and worship our Heavenly Father. Make it a great week by getting your life right tonight. Don't wait any longer. Come now as we stand and as we sing.